I'm going to finish off today Acts chapter 15. You may have noticed if you were following along last week that there was just a small section at the end of chapter 15, and I felt like it was different enough to warrant its own discussion, its own topic. It's so different. If you remember at the beginning of Acts chapter 15, we have Paul and Barnabas getting in the argument with the Judaizers. They're trying to figure out, what does it mean? What do we actually have to do to be saved, right? They're wrestling with this question because this is a very important question to answer. If there's something that we need to do to be saved, isn't that vitally important that we know what that is? And so that was something they had to wrestle with, and what they finally came to was, look, the grace of God is here. The grace of God is what saves us, and then this is what's so important for us to understand. But what they ended up sending out, if you remember, it was following the principle of love God with all of your heart and love people, right? The second commandment being just as important, love people as you love yourself. Then, in that vein, we got those 4 rules that then, in last week's message, we talked about how they actually had to go out and spread that news, right? Because people won't actually know, people won't actually hear unless they actually go out and people actually are taking the message with them. If you don't take the message, if you don't go and make the effort to actually take it and spread it, it's not actually going to get spread. It's just going to sit there idly, right? It's like writing something down and shoving it in a drawer and then wondering why people aren't talking about it or why it hasn't transformed life. Of course it hasn't. It needs to get out there. People need to read it. People need to hear it. People need to know. It's why we were talking about it even this morning. Because I know that so many people struggle with reading, and it's why I so often, and I always promote it in the video as well. There's always a link to an audio Bible, a free audio Bible resource. Because I know a lot of people struggle with reading, but a lot of people can sit there and listen to the Bible, and it's amazing. I went through the entire book of Ezekiel yesterday in the matter of a few hours. I remember I went through the entire book of Acts in the matter of an hour. It doesn't take long to actually listen to the Bible. And it's amazing how impactful that can be to your life. Going through and listening to the Psalms, hearing these praises to Jesus, being familiar with the Word. But again, you're only going to get there if someone makes that available to you. And that's why when I take it out, I'm trying to give that to you guys as well. Because if you remember, the whole principle that we came across was that although we're set free from the law is still useful. There's a reason why our Bibles are this thick. Okay? There's a reason why we didn't just throw out the first 2/3 of our Bible and we kept them around, despite the fact that, I'm not sure if you know this, Old Testament means the old covenant, right? This is the Old Covenant, and New Testament are New Covenant, right? We're under the New Covenant. So you'd be like, well then why do we have to read all this stuff about the Old Covenant? Because it reveals to us who God is, what His desires are, and what His desires for us are. It's amazingly informative. It shows us His mercy and His grace, even in the times of old, and how important it is for us to recognize the same God then and now. And so, not only that, we also come up with this question, and we're going to kind of come across this here in a bit. But it was largely what they were talking about for most of Acts chapter 15 is, how do we behave like a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? And how do I look like a Christian? How do I behave like one? Well, you're not going to know that if you don't read the Bible. And the Bible is there not because, and we don't follow the rules of the law because we're trying to earn our salvation, but because we're trying to live a life that is pleasing and good to God. We want to say, God, you are good. I want to honor you. I think you're precious to me, and I want to respect you, and I want to live a certain way that shows this. And so let's start by reading. And so of course this ends up leading to certain kind of fights and arguments and stuff like this. And this is something I was thinking about this morning when I was preparing this. People argue, right? And this whole chapter started with an argument between the Judaizers and Paul and Barnabas. What does it mean to be saved? And people argue. I think that it's a totally normal, totally healthy thing to do. You need to actually be able to converse and talk about things, despite how you may feel about the argument in and of itself. I think this is hilarious because it's one of the things Claire hates it when Rebecca and I argue. And it's funny because sometimes we're not even arguing. We're just both upset by the same thing. And we're just kind of like venting about it. And all she hears is like angry voices. And she gets, she's like, Mom, why are you going to fight? We're like, we're not even fighting, we're agreeing. Like, we're in total agreement right now. This thing is just really annoying to us or really upsetting to us, whatever it may be. And I think that it's part of what helps our marriage grow is like when we have disagreement, we need to converse, we need to talk about it. Because our love is so much deeper than just some small disagreement. And I bring that up because of what we're going to be talking about here today. In your Bibles, if you follow along it's oftentimes have the little subtitles, and your subtitle might talk about there's a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. And remember, Paul and Barnabas in chapter 14, they went around, they're spreading the gospels, they're the best of friends, they're good work colleagues, they're working really well together, they're doing all this stuff together. Like they are the duo. And it says in verse 36, sometime later Paul said to Barnabas, so this is sometime after the time of the council, let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Now we made it one verse in, so I'm going to have to pause again. Because why is this important to them? And you've heard me say this before, right? It's because they love these churches. And when I say love, I think there's a big problem here. And again, I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this as well, right? Love today in 21st century Canada tends to mean good feelings. Right? When we say we need to love, when people hear Jesus say, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love people as yourself, they would say a loving action is one that causes the other person to feel good, have good feelings. Right? In fact, they would say if you were to cause a person to be sad, that would be unloving. But I want to tell you, when we're reading the Bible, when we're listening to the words of Jesus, we're not listening to a 21st century Jesus. We're listening to a first century Jesus, a Jesus who spoke the language at that time and let us understand love as they understood it, not as our culture tends to describe it today. See, love is so much deeper than that. When Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, when he's saying love, he means that person should, and he describes this in one of his parables, that person should be like a precious jewel to you that is of great value, and it is precious, and you want to care for it, and you want to be gentle with it, and you want to make sure, but you also don't want to make sure it stays clear of impurity, and you have great respect and honor and value in that person. When he says to love your wife as Christ loved the church, he's saying that your spouse, your wife, the husbands, needs to be of the utmost value to you. There should be nothing you value more. When Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, he means there should be nothing you value more. Nothing that is more precious to you, nothing that has a greater grip on you than God himself. But the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. When Paul and Barnabas say they want to go back to these believers in these towns and see how they're doing, it's because they love them. These people, the churches, and the people that make them up are precious to them. They care about them so much. And the reason I want to focus in on that, this idea of love, is about value and care and honor and respect, is because it's more than good feelings. Because when Paul and Barnabas would go back to these churches that they loved so deeply, they would often also bring correction. Well, correction, who here has been corrected? It doesn't feel good, does it? We don't like to be found insufficient. It's often good for us, and we are often grateful for it later on down the road, because when we take correction, we actually apply it to our lives, we can grow and become better. But that is what real love is. And I really wanted to focus in on that because sometimes real love argues. Verse 37, Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia, and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. If you remember, that's the island in the east of the Mediterranean, just off the west coast of where they are. But Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria north and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. They got in a fight. They got in a big fight. They got in such a big fight that they're no longer working together. Now, what's important for us to recognize is in this particular fight is that they're both right. Right? Barnabas has every reason to want to bring Mark into the fold and say, look, Mark may have made some mistakes, Mark may have not followed through, not been with us in the past, but we need to trust in God. We need to trust that God is using Mark to do all these great things. And so we need to put our faith in him right now. We need to put our trust in God and lead Mark with us and bring him with us and help encourage and build him up so that he can also be a great apostle. And then Paul is also right when he says, I don't know that I can trust someone that's already betrayed me once, who's already left me once. How do I know he won't do it again? Right? So you can kind of understand both sides of this argument. But one of the key things I think is absolutely vital with this conversation, and it's something that I think is missing so much in our culture today because we have the internet, is we're going to see later on Paul and Barnabas are back together, and they're great. They're brothers in Christ, and they still love one another. But I think it's because when we have disagreements, right? If you have a disagreement with someone on the internet, you're having a disagreement with an avatar. And this, unfortunately, has created this new idea in our culture that is incredibly negative and horribly bad for us. Where when we have a disagreement with us, we're not just in a difference of opinion, they've actually now become like enemy. Right? This is a problem. This is a big problem. Because as Christians, we're called to be above that. We're called not to fall into that. We're instead called to be loving. Remember, God said, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, I tell you, love your enemy. And that's incredibly difficult for us to do sometimes. But we can kind of understand that because if you're sitting down here in the church and you're having a disagreement with someone, but you're actually sitting across from each other face to face, it's a lot more difficult to visualize them as your enemy if you understand who they truly are. See, Paul and Barnabas understand who the other one really is. Paul knows Barnabas loves these churches, that he loves God with all of his heart, that he wants nothing but the very best for these churches in Cyprus and all through Asia Minor. And Barnabas knows Paul also is in love with God, holds God as the most precious thing in his life. There's a reason why he was the Pharisee of Pharisees, because he always valued God. He was just mistaken about how to get there. Right? And once he accepted the grace of Jesus Christ, that's what motivated him to get out there and spread the good news and tell everybody what was going on. The fruit of his life, the priorities of his life were obvious to everyone who was a witness. And so, it was obvious to Barnabas what was important to Paul. And so when we see this split here, we don't see a great big bickering and the church split right in half, and suddenly one can't talk to the other, and all of a sudden we have to have two different church doctrines. Instead, what we see is, you know what? We both want to complete the same thing. We both want to do the same objective. We're just having a difference of opinion that's causing us not to be able to work together. Many of us have been in those situations, and Rebecca knows for sure I've been in one. And let me tell you, can you imagine if Barnabas said to Paul, no, Paul, I'm right, you're going to come with me, and we're going to take Mark, and you're going to like it. It probably wouldn't have gone so well, right? If you've ever been forced to be in that situation, and many of us have been in a situation like that, where it's not necessarily that the other person is the worst person in the world, we just don't get along. we have a difference of opinion, or we're both trying to strive for the same objective, but we want to come at it from a different angle. It can be incredibly frustrating. And I know, like, I've been in that very situation, and it nearly drove me to a nervous breakdown. Like, I nearly had a mental breakdown over it because it's just so stressful. But instead, what we see here is two men who recognize each other's true intention. They both love the church. They both have high value of God. And they realize, you know what? Let's just keep doing what we're doing, but separately. Like, we have a difference of opinion. That's it. Let's not cause a feud. Let's not cause a split. Let's not cause a big ruckus. Why don't we continue to go and do exactly what we wanted to do? Remember, it said, let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns that we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. They still go and do that. They just do it separate, right? Barnabas heads off to Cyprus. Saul heads north. This is important for us to recognize. Because, especially as Christians, because if you talk to a lot of non-believers, there's two main reasons why non-believers don't believe. Number one is they can't be bothered to actually think about it. That's like, I honestly think this is the number one reason. Most people will say, oh, I'm atheist or agnostic, but what that really tends to mean is I haven't actually bothered to think about this, and I'm not going to. Why? Because it's hard. It's really hard to wrestle through the things of spirituality. It's really hard to wrestle through things of faith, right? Wondering whether or not this here is authentic, whether actually going through the evidence and determining whether or not Jesus really rose from the dead. Like, to actually go through and wrestle through this and go through it by yourself is difficult. It's a real challenge. So I understand why a lot of people don't do it. But the other thing is, you'll have people who were once Christians who are no longer Christian. And why is that? Usually because of a fight that didn't go as amicably as this. Because instead, when they got into a fight, maybe one person, suddenly it's like we forget. It's like suddenly we forget that we're both still Christians. We're both still after God's heart. We both want what the Lord has called for us. But we get into these clashes that then sour people away from the church because they go, wait, what do you mean I can't listen to this type of music? What do you mean I can't, wear a ball cap into church? What do you mean, you know what I mean? Like, we fight over little things that don't matter. And we drive people away. Instead of recognizing where our heart really is. I remember I've heard it argued before. If you want to have a real argument with somebody, try and argue it from their side first, because then you'll have a lot more empathy for their position. Right? Maybe they're still wrong, but you'll at least understand, and you won't be so you won't attack, you won't be so vicious with it, but instead you'll look at you'll look much like these guys, Paul and Barnabas, and you'll go, wait a minute, Barnabas, you still want to serve God. You're still trying to do what's best for the church. And Paul, you still love God, and you're still trying to do what's best for the church. How about we both keep going and do what's best for God, do what we follow our love for God and do what's best for the church. But why don't we go our separate ways and both go and encourage? I think if we had more and more conflict resolution dealt with in a more biblical manner like this, we'd have less former Christians in this world. Fact is, sometimes we cling too hard to the things that don't matter. And I think that's one of the great things that we learn about in Acts chapter 15. What are the things that really matter? Don't cause your neighbor to stumble, and love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Right? Come all the way back to what Jesus taught when he was walking this earth. Love God with your whole heart. Treat him like he's the most precious thing in the world to you. Like you want to honor and glorify him. That he is incredibly important and valuable. And not only that, so is your neighbor. So are the people around you. And remember, that extends beyond the people that you get along with, right? It means even your enemies, they are of value. They have value because they are created in the image of God. They are God's children too. Whether or not they are the prodigal son who is away from God at the moment, or whether or not they've come back, it doesn't matter. They are created in the Father's image. So we need to remember that when we're getting into arguments are okay. Arguments are normal. Debate and dispute is a part of life. But we need to understand who it is we're arguing with. We're arguing with a child of God. We need to treat them like such. Right? Because we treat those that we love differently than those we love less when we argue with them. Right? And now I lost my place. So Paul takes Silas and he leaves, and as we're going to continue on through the book of Acts, we're going to see more and more about what's happening with Paul. And we're going to see, by the way, this is not the last time that Paul's going to have a dispute. And in fact, we're going to see in many instances that Paul's actually going to rebuke even some of the heads of the church. Because that in and of itself isn't unloving. That's why I brought up the whole terrible 21st century version of love. Because Paul, in his love for the church, in his love for the other apostles and the other leadership, he says, you know what? In my love for you, I need to tell you when you're doing wrong. I need to tell you what you can do to do right. And I need to tell you, and I need to encourage you where you're doing well, and I need to help you understand where you're falling short. That's what real love is. And to be honest, it's not that complicated when you explain it. Like when you hear it, people go, yeah, of course it's like that. But for some reason in our culture today, that's not the way that they hear it. Maybe we need to come up with a new word for it. I don't know. But let us, as we go forward today, let's keep that in mind. Let's remember that as we have disagreements, as we have arguments, remember who it is that we're arguing with, and make sure that when we go into these times, when we have these disputes, when we have these disagreements, that we understand who it is that we're arguing with, and that it is in fact a child of God, and that we don't mistreat someone who's so precious. That it should reflect in our attitude that they are precious to us, that we do care about them, even when we're